Let's go ahead and welcome Paul Saffo to the stage. He's our moderator for the panel, and he'll be introducing the panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Let's go ahead and get our panelists seated. Just a quick show of hands. Who was here on Sunday? Good. I saw some familiar faces. So here's what we're going to accomplish this evening. Sunday was a day focused on the 1968 demo, Doug's work that led up to that demo, and the consequences and the impact on the world that the demo had. So you can think about Sunday was 1968 up to the present with a hint of what lies ahead and saying all the important tasks we need to do. Tonight, we're going to pick up the conversation in the present and go out another 50 years. And so if Sunday was focused, at least in part, upon the enormous technical challenges that had to be met to make that demo happen, and then the attempts to diffuse it further out, tonight is going to be focused more tightly on, basically the way I think it is, we're tapping into the motivations that Doug had that led to the 1968 demo, because we all know that at the end of the day, Doug was about people and organizations. Computers just happened to have been the tool that he had at hand. If Doug had been working in 1452, he would have been working with movable type, because that was the available technology at the time. So that's the agenda for this evening. And to put a very sharp point on it, we need more Engelbarts. In the sense that we need more people who are long-distance thinkers and long-distance doers tackling the greatest challenges facing us ahead, because, quite frankly, the challenges have continued to grow faster than we've grown before. So now let me sit down. I'll introduce our panelists. And I have to look at my notes for this, because I have the opposite situation of most panels where you don't know the panelists. When I was thinking about this, I thought, I got to make this introduction short and efficient. So I limited myself to one page for all three of you. We'll see how well I do here. All the way over on my left, your right, Erika Woolsey is the founder and CEO of Hydrus. And she's a marine biologist, Dr. Erika Woolsey, forgive me, and she is an ocean design fellow at Stanford, associated with the Hopkins Research Lab. And in addition, since my bias, she's teaching at the D School, and I teach at the D School as well. So it's wonderful to have her at Stanford. She leads expeditions. She's a kayaker. She's also what's your highest? You're a master diver?
I'm a dive master.
Dive master, yes. And she also, this is my favorite, she works as a volunteer at volunteer diver at the California Academy of Sciences, which means she does windows. So next time you're in the Cal Academy and there's a diver going past wiping the windows, take a look. If you see the blonde locks coming out from under the wetsuit, it just could be Erika.
We have to wear hoods. So it's hard to tell.
I thought so. Well, then wave at her. If she waves back, you'll know it was Erika. Next, Erika is Ben Rattray. 2007, Ben started Change.org. How many people here are Change.org members? Show of hands. It's up to 250 million now, isn't it? And it is the largest platform for social change on the planet, and a marvelous example of exactly the sort of thing Doug would have absolutely loved, is how do you scale things up. He was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential individuals on the planet. More importantly, he's a Stanford grad. He also went someplace in London, the London School of Economics or something or another, and he's a Californian as well, from Santa Barbara. Last but not least is Erika Gregory. Erika is the managing director at NSquare, which is a cross-disciplinary effort to work on reducing the nuclear threat She's also a serial entrepreneur. She started the Idea Factory and Collective Invention before NSquare, and she is a forecaster by profession. She was involved with Global Business Network, which in its day was a real pioneer in scenario planning and the like. So here's how we're going to do it. I've asked each one of our panels to give us an appetizer, just a couple of minutes about their work and where they see it touches on Doug's vision. And then we're going to throw this open into a conversation. And I'm still not sure how I'm going to get the two Erika things.
We'll just both look at you every time you say it.
Okay, or we could change your name for the, no, I won't.
That would be fine with me, actually.
Let's start with Erika Woolsey.
All right, so as Paul explained, I'm a marine biologist, and I was so compelled by coral reefs. So my specialty is coral reef ecology. I did a lot of my research in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef, so I've been extremely lucky to explore these really beautiful and vitally important ocean ecosystems. And I had a front row seat to the mass destruction of coral reefs over the period from 2015 to 2017, which, because of higher than normal ocean temperatures, coral reefs started to bleach or turn white and die. And over just a couple of years, about half of the Great Barrier Reef bleached. And so it was around that time I started really thinking about how maybe knowledge isn't our limiting factor in solving these problems. Maybe it's all about the translation of scientific discovery into public understanding and behavior change and political action. And so I moved back to the Bay Area where I grew up, and I became a co-founder of a nonprofit called The Hydrus, and our tagline is Open Access Oceans. So we wanted to make science accessible and beautiful and visual. And we play around with different types of technologies. We started out doing 3D models of coral reefs through underwater photogrammetry and have made these data-rich and beautiful digital files open access online. And they've been used by educators and scientists and artists to share coral reefs. And we also are working with virtual reality. And what I've been trying to do a lot of my life is bring everybody to the ocean, because I really believe that you can't really care about and work to protect something you never see or experience. And the advancements in immersive reality and virtual reality are pretty astonishing. And so at the Hydrus, we've been making virtual reality experiences to try to replicate what it's like to go diving. And there's some really interesting research I know coming out of Stanford as well on how that kind of technology can improve empathy towards environmental issues. So I'm really interested in learning more about what this can do for the oceans. And something that really resonates with me regarding Doug Engelbart's work is just the notion of networks and scaling. Because the ocean is so huge that every problem in the ocean is a huge problem. And we have warming ocean temperatures, ocean acidification, all of the heat that's in our atmosphere, about 93% of it goes into the ocean, and ocean acidification. And so the IPCC report that was released recently, the latest one, says that we basically have 12 years, so until 2030, to reduce our carbon emissions by about 45% in order to hit the target of warming above pre-industrial levels by only 1.5, so keeping it to 1.5 instead of 2. And that difference, even though it's just half a degree average globally, it is the difference of having coral reefs completely gone everywhere on Earth versus still having coral reef ecosystems that can support tremendous biodiversity and support human communities. And in order to reach this goal set by the IPCC report, we really need rapid and unprecedented change across all of society globally. And so I'm very interested in the idea of raising the global IQ and creating these systems and using technology as a tool.
As we were organizing this panel, I was imagining, what if Doug were here and what would he take from this? And he would instantly resonate with your emphasis on systems, as thinking like a systems builder and technology as a tool. Ben.
Yeah, when I reflect on this, what is most striking to me is the stark disconnect between the extent to which we've had technology-driven leveraging of collective intelligence for many industries around transportation, communication, logistics, pricing, ad targeting, and the whatnot, and how little that has been the case in the realm of politics and democracy and policy. Despite the immense consequences, I think largely negative, of the way in which we proceed in that domain currently. And if you look at, I think it's worth breaking down how broken it actually is and how unintelligent it actually is. I mean, first of all, there's three, I think, fundamental problems. The first is the extent to which people's limited information actually makes it the case that their actual preferences are not adequately represented oftentimes by their votes or their polling for different issues. You see this a lot with deliberative polling. James Fishkin at Stanford has demonstrated this pretty consistently, where the more information you give people in controlled environments, actually you recognize that their expressed policy preferences aren't really what they should be. The second is, even insofar as we had an accurate mapping of individual people's preferences, there's been a lot of research around how there's effectively very little to no correlation between the preferences of the mass public and ultimate policy outcomes in Washington, D.C. It's literally almost entirely directly causal related to sort of special interests and elite interests. And the third is, even if we had an accurate understanding of people's preferences and efficient mapping onto that for legislative purposes, and there's a lot of things you might say about how to craft legislation. One of the words you would not use in characterizing it is intelligent. I mean, it is a remarkably painful, I don't know, I worked in DC for a while after Stanford, and it was a painful process. And so what is tragic, I think, to me in looking at this is looking, again, at another divide, which is the disconnect between how bad it really is and how much we accept it seemingly with little protest. The systemic focus that we have on so many other issues except the most fundamental way in which we have representative democracy. Like, we celebrate how old our system is. In every other domain, we celebrate innovation, improvements, augmentation, and we have this reflexive deference to age in this case. And literally, if you had a new opportunity to craft a new society and leveraging all the information that we have today in technology, there's just no way you'd create a representative democracy with the type of systems we have today. And so what I think is worth contemplating is, well, what would that look like? And what is surprising to me is, I think there's one at least pretty sort of robust, fecund path that few people have really pursued. And I'll outline it briefly because I think there is an opportunity to use collective intelligence in highly leveraged ways in the service of humankind in the long term in the democratic space. And it really is, it's the liquid democracy, deliberative democracy, and what effectively is a space between representative democracy and direct democracy. And I mention it because we will, I think hopefully many organizations try to enact a system like this. I think it has to happen outside the government, but I'll just walk through briefly, basically. I think there's three parts. So right now we're trying to aggregate the largest audience possible to represent at least 50% of voters in the world's democracies. We are about 20% for the world's biggest democracies right now. As we get that audience, what we want to be able to do is to, one, so deliver to every, let's say, American, half of American voters, a personalized ballot directly on their mobile phone the day before the primary and the general. The second thing is, on that ballot, we think that what needs to happen is we call a trust graph. So people will identify the people and organizations they trust the most, whose opinions they respect on policy or on individual selection of candidates or ballot initiatives. By following those people, they then can look at your phone in real time at any time right before you vote. And when you look at the 40 different offices with such little information and all the ballot initiatives, you can look at 30 seconds at a personalized ballot and use those as proxies for informing your vote. And insofar as we're able to do this with any degree of leverage, 10, 20% of the public, which I think is possible, Then the people who are the most trusted, you've built this trust graph of people who have basically been proxied, have been delegated power in a way, will be the most influential people, I think, in America. And we'll then map that onto an opportunity for anyone to propose legislation in the country. Anybody can crowdsource it, suggest it, and there is then a map of the most trusted people who will endorse or oppose legislation. And because of the influence this trust graph will have on the ultimate elections and the next elections, elected officials will be highly incentivized to pay attention. It's not to say that that specific system in particular will work, we'll be able to execute, or it will be the ultimate solution. I think we will have a really good chance of this. It's merely to highlight like that kind of thinking. Like, it's striking to me the dearth of investments in that kind of what seems to be radical, but I see quite pragmatic and necessary applications of technology and collective intelligence in service of addressing the biggest problems of our time, which, whether we like it or not, our government is doing every day.
And I think of the work that you do at change.org, and you know, you're going right to the heart of the notion of collective intelligence. And talking to folks who were around at the start of the World Wide Web and who helped design it, you know, you have the feeling that it's a little bit, they were surprised. They thought the system would naturally amplify intelligence, and it seems to have done the opposite. And you know, it reminds me of the famous comment by Einstein that the difference between intelligence and stupidity is that intelligence has its limits.
And social media has no limits.
And social media has no limits, but I still like cat videos.
And one comment on, you know, this idea of leveraging trust, it's not new, right? I mean, the web is based upon, the most effective platforms on the internet are using technology, many of them, are leveraging trust networks. I mean, Google PageRank is basically a trust network of people that are proxying relevance based upon hyperlinks that are registered as votes for the most relevant site. You know, you have things like eBay would never have worked but for a trust network of random buyers and random sellers that no one knew otherwise. I mean, imagine Uber or Lyft or Airbnb with no trust graph. Wikipedia, I mean, this happens all, so we don't have this for political information or for voting, but we have this for commerce and basic transactions. And I think there's a real missing piece there, and I think there's a real opportunity.
Good. Erika.
Yes.
Gregory.
Yes. Well, I did not know Doug Engelbart, but a lot of his thinking has really influenced my career in ways big and small. And one thing I was thinking about earlier when we were watching the video and listening to Christina is the degree to which it must have been frustrating to Doug to be able to make real progress on some of the technical solutions that he cared so much about, but not really be able to accelerate human evolution in quite the same way. And I'm really struck by the fact that in looking at the graph that Christina showed, we do have this tremendous advancement technologically, and we have tools now that should make us better at cooperative work and at collective action, and again, should be improving our collective IQ. And yet, we don't really, by and large, have the same facility with the kinds of softer skills or the human systems that would allow us to make good on the promise that he was really trying to realize. And so I'm here not because I'm an expert about nuclear weapons, which I'm sure will become obvious as I talk, but I am somebody who knows a lot about creating teams who are quite good at doing cooperative work across boundaries, across sectors, and so forth. And I was asked 5 years ago to work on nuclear weapons. And really the remit was to accelerate our global nuclear arms control agreements, the achievement of those goals. You know, one short way to say that is that we would like to think that nuclear weapons will never be used again, either by accident or by design. But I reflect on, as I think about that task, I think about the fact that 70 years ago, we saw a cooperation in the scientific community that was probably unprecedented in human history, and that was during the Manhattan Project. For better or worse, there was tremendous cooperation, and there was tremendous innovation happening, and there was a group of people who were working on not just the margins, but at the very heart of a wicked problem, which both of you have talked about, wicked problems. We know something about wicked problems now. We know that they're really a complex of many different types of problems, dilemmas, puzzles, and so forth. And we know about wicked problems that just by the nature of working on them, you change them, not always for the better. And part of the notion of working on wicked problems is you have a responsibility then for the outcomes of everything that you do, for the unintended consequences of what you do. And when you think about nuclear weapons, what happened is that 75 years ago, we locked in to some of the solutions that came out of the Manhattan Project, and there have been tremendous downstream consequences. We locked in politically, culturally, technologically on some of those solutions, and they have shaped everything for the last 70 years. They've shaped politics, they've shaped culture, they've shaped the way we work with each other globally. But a lot of people have been hurt by that early lock-in. Certainly anybody who lives downwind of any nuclear test sites have been hurt, and a lot of those are native peoples around the world. And I would say it's probably not a stretch to say that our democracy has actually been hurt in the sense that there's really not a less democratic process than making decisions about nuclear weapons globally. Some of you may have heard of this expression, the nuclear priesthood. But what happened when we locked in around nuclear weapons is that we created a very insular group of people, and we ceded responsibility for their decisions to them, thinking that it was too complex, that we didn't have a way to engage with the issues. 1980, a lot of people did go to Central Park, and I'm not belittling that. We certainly had a very active anti-nuclear movement at one time. But in the last 30 years or so, that has not been the case. People don't feel that they have a way to engage, and so we've really sort of walked away from this issue. So what we're trying to work on now is, and I'm struck actually by some of the things that Ben was just talking about in terms of liquid democracy, I'm struck by the opportunity that we have now to bring back some of that collaborative spirit that the Manhattan Project originally represented, and to move at a time where deterrence theory begins to break down in the 21st century, when we have non-state actors who are trying to get their hands on bomb-making materials, nuclear bomb-making materials. Deterrence theory breaks down when you have a guy drop a socket in Damascus, Arkansas, and at a Titan II missile silo, and nearly destroyed that entire part of the nation. It was really only by accident that that didn't happen.
Well, it was a red state.
It was, he said that, was not me.
Only in Silicon Valley.
Just making a joke.
But we have, the fact is we have dropped nuclear weapons on our own soil more than once. I could go on and on and on. So what happens? What we've become really interested in is how we bust up the nuclear priesthood. I'd like to think, I don't know, Christina, if this is true, but I'd like to think that Doug might recognize some of his ideas in what we're trying to do, because yes, some of the people we work with in building a network of innovators to work on this problem, some of them are working on technological solutions, but a lot of them are thinking about how do we act like designers? How do we act actually like scientists, working iteratively, testing our hypotheses, bringing cognitive diversity to the problem, recognizing that if we all think the same, we're going to miss the opportunities to do something very different than we've ever done before. So we're creating teams that are international, teams that are cross-sectoral, and we're not really accepting anymore that nuclear weapons are the purview of only a few. We're saying, no, actually, there's a way, if you're a data scientist, there's an opportunity for you to engage on this issue. If you're a media producer, there's an opportunity for you to make a difference. I don't know if folks here watch Madam Secretary. Does anybody in the room watch Madam Secretary? See some hands up. Season finale last year and then the season opener this year both dealt with nuclear weapons themes. Why was that? Because we made a grant to an organization that works with writers' rooms, that works with producers, and caught the attention of the showrunners of Madam Secretary, who said, we actually can use our platform to better educate the public about this issue so people don't think of nuclear weapons as just the button that you hit to win a game, for instance, in a video game, but really understand the potential consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. So what we're looking at is a bias toward openness, an invitation for many people to engage organically from wherever they are, whatever expertise they bring. For all of you in technology, there are ways to make a difference on this issue. And we're very heavily engaged in building the kinds of networks that I'd like to think that Doug Engelbart dreamed of.
As you were talking, I was struck by a couple of connections with Doug's work. First of all, evolution was a word that he used often, and I know that's central to your work. Also, the problem you're trying to solve, also in its origins, is what led to Doug's inspiration, because of course, Vannevar Bush's 1945 article, as we may think, was the public shorthand version of his report to the president, Science: Endless Frontiers, which was written at that moment in time where the scientists and the team, the small team that worked on the Manhattan Project, looked at it as enormous success, and they wanted to take their collaborative lessons and spread them out to the rest of the world, which to me raises a fascinating question that runs through all of what you're talking about is, what's the difference between small groups and large groups, and what is the role of each, and how does a successful small group spread something to a large group without it getting all screwed up? I don't know, Ben, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we think about a lot is when I talk about the tragic dearth of the leveraging of collective intelligence in public policy, I think it is distinct actually from what is possible in private capacity, either in NGOs or in companies. And so I think it is the case that we have already demonstrated for many of the world, I mean, for climate change, for example, as well, that we have the capacity of small groups of experts in distributed ways with distinct sets of knowledge that come together that can actually have real substantial impact on these issues, and I think that's totally necessary. And it is a case that for most of these issues, without having an adoption by either the mass public or the government, or the government because of the mass public, you can't actually have, I think, a fundamental solution to most of them. So they're both necessary. I will just say one of the challenges that I see, especially frankly in a place like Silicon Valley, is we see government as so dysfunctional, understandably, inefficient and sort of incompetent, and something to just sort of be looked at from a distance. And then we want to look at sort of the capacity that we have independent of government to iterate and sort of innovate and create new possibilities, all of which are beautiful. I think we can't ignore that we also have to play that game. That we also have to look at collective intelligence at a larger scale and not just create solutions, because if those are not supported by the mass public, we can have the most brilliant interventions for most public policy challenges, and it won't matter. I mean, it will matter somewhat, but for many issues, it won't matter nearly as much as it needs to.
Mm-hmm. And I'm interested to hear from Erika on how the Manhattan Project may have played a role in the basic public distrust of science. And also based on what Ben was saying, I mean, how do we make sure that our collective IQ and our intelligence has the right information? So is there a departure from expertise?
So I'll comment on or respond to your question, and I know there's maybe a question behind your question because we talked earlier about this. So in terms of the public's distrust of science, I think the fact is that people in the scientific community exited the Manhattan Project with plenty of distrust of their own. We all know the stories about scientists who walked away thinking, what have we wrought here? The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which is still alive today, really began as an expression of the consciences of those scientists at the Manhattan Project who needed an outlet for their doubt and for their concern. But really, I would say the maybe more productive response was evidence in the form of what Robert Oppenheimer's brother Frank did with the creation of the San Francisco Exploratorium. He wrote a monograph. Christina Woolsey is here. She could tell this story better than I. Wrote a monograph about moving toward an exploratorium, which would be a place that children and adults and people of all shapes and sizes could come and experience science in a hands-on setting, partly to disabuse the public of the sort of fear and concern about science as something separate from their ordinary lives that they had no agency over.
But that question of public distrust of science, that moment in time was almost the reverse of today. The scientists had deep disquiet. Einstein famously observed, if only I'd known I would have become a watchmaker. And Lord knows Robert Oppenheimer was the Promethean figure. But the public loved nuclear power, and it was decades before it flipped. What was the change?
Well, the public may have loved nuclear power, and the public still loves nuclear power. I'm not sure that the world loved nuclear weapons after Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yes, that's a good point.
But at that point, I think the sense was that the genie was out of the bottle, and there's really very little that the average person can do to make any difference whatsoever to reverse the tide of human events. So I really think it's important that we distinguish between what happened, the innovations that came out of the Manhattan Project in terms of the use of energy, and the weaponization of that energy, which has, I think, quite a different history.
Erika W. I think I've got this. You're going to be Erika G and
good.
Erika W. Mei-Lin Feng sent up a question, and I apologize to Mei-Lin wherever she is. I'm not going to ask your question because you put a word in your question that's so important. Empathy. Ben, your work is all about empathy. In particular, how do you create empathy for something where people can't go into it like you? You've seen the ocean. What role does empathy play in these challenges today?
So what's interesting is I've been at the Stanford D School for about 3 or 4 months, and that culture is new to me, and I've been recently introduced to human-centered design thinking. And I was very interested to learn about the role of a designer in generating and using empathy as a tool. And maybe previously I would think that when it comes to managing ocean ecosystems and protecting natural resources, it was all about understanding that ecology and the biology and the physics and the oceanography. But I am now a big believer that it's all about managing people. And the idea of need finding and designing for systems and designing something for one user in mind rather than 100 or 1 million. And that is what I see as making it really possible to scale and grow when you're empathizing with individuals. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how I can inspire people to change behaviors related to ocean issues, whether it's marine pollution, overfishing, or climate change. And no one wants to be bombarded with facts. No one wants to be shamed, right? And so the practice I found the most effective and also the most enjoyable is just listening and empathizing and discussing. And I really hope that, full heart, clear eyes, can't lose is an approach that will work and will scale, because it's all about connecting people to each other and to natural environments.
Yeah, this is a foundational part of our work as well.
I think of change.org as an empathy engine.
I mean, absolutely. Storytelling is at the core of what we do. And just as you said, Erika, people don't access issues through abstract data and policy in many cases. We're not all that effective at sort of getting people to take civic action through moralizing and trying to tell them that they're wrong by not doing so or criticizing them. It's by how do you access. The remarkable thing about humans, most of us, is that we have this incredible capacity for generating empathy for others when we're exposed to remarkable personal stories that resonate. When we do so, we take action not because we think we're obliged to, but out of sincere desire, and it's an opportunity for us to express our values and build connection. And so when we see this all the time around healthcare or human trafficking or immigration or gay rights or whatnot, it's rarely, I mean, few people wake up every day and think, oh, what I really want to do today is like fight for, against human trafficking or against acid attacks in India or all these other topics. But when across your feed on Facebook or in a news article or an email, you see a remarkable personal story, you resonate with that person, despite knowing them not whatsoever, like we see incredible outpouring of support and mobilization because of that. And so I think it's incumbent upon the people in professions like ours that are trying to mobilize the public, rather than berating people for not taking action, taking it upon ourselves to be responsible for crafting the kind of experiences that will engage and mobilize the public at scale. And that's a lot of things we think about. It relates to a point I talked to my team about, which is, the user experience of civic participation kind of sucks. Like, the experience of voting is just not that compelling. The experience of, like, if the epitome of, if civic duty is going to a city council meeting, like, there is nothing more insufferable than sitting in a 4-hour city council meeting. It is remarkable, and believe me.
School board meetings, I think, actually more insufferable, yeah.
And so,
But now, hold on a second here. So I think of
Are you on a school board?
No, and you wouldn't catch me dead at one. But the New England Town Hall is often held up as the exemplar of, Norman Rockwell, and those things still work. You talk to people in parts of New England, they still work. How do we recreate that online?
I think the question is, how do we create a system, instead of how do we replicate the thing that exists offline right now online, how do we get what we want out of it, which is an effective representation of citizens being able to engage and hear other people's diverse perspectives, express their own, and feel like their voice is heard, even if it's disagreed with and ultimately overturned. And so for us, we think of, okay, well, I talk a lot, so I'm just laughing because my team and I had this conversation today, and I said, if you had a product that nobody was buying, you can either condemn your non-buyers or create a better product. And literally, like, not a lot of people are buying civic engagement in an ongoing, sustained way, and we can just condemn people for not buying that product or just make a better product. So what we're trying to do is to create a means by which citizens can come together, look at issues that they care about, see the perspectives and opinions of other people they trust and respect, or deliberations and debate between them, and then make a choice. And when they take action to express their voice, be able to follow on and see the ultimate consequences of that. I mean, really the experience I want is people take action on their phone, anytime, anywhere, with people they align with, and receive a video response from their mayor or member of Congress within a week on their phone. And that's totally an experience we should be able to deliver. And if you can do that, that's just a dramatically better participation experience. If you look at, like, right now, why is it the case that you have, like, more photos are taken today than the total number of photos ever taken in all of human history until, 2005? It's not like people became much more interested in photos, just far easier to do and more compelling. And we want to make civic participation far easier to access and more compelling. And if you get that, you do unlock the opportunity, because humans want to express voice and hear, feel like they are having their voice reflected in public form.
Well, it's that. I also think it's a plot by the cats.
So can I just respond to
Please,
this real
Eric,
quickly?
I want to point out the fact that in one of your prior lives, you were a very skilled scenario designer. So I'd love a scenario thinker's take on these issues.
Oh, well, that's not what I was going to say, but I will come back to that.
Yeah, you come back to it.
So let me just respond to this real quick, which is, I think when you asked the question about empathy, and you also earlier asked a question about scale, essentially, when you said, how do we take small teams and potentially create a benevolent virus so larger teams are positively infected with that? I think these two things are very much connected. The idea that you can speak to one person, that you can create a connection with one person, or that you can create the conditions in which people who should not be able to get along do get along because they have something shared that they can agree on that they're working toward. So in our experience, we have people who are sitting in the belly of the beast at the national labs. who go to work every day and they think their job is to keep the world safe. And then we have NGOs who think their job is to make sure that those labs don't get funded because they're the bad guys. And so what we've begun to get good at, I won't say we're perfect at it, is creating the conditions where in small groups in Washington, D.C., or in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or in London, we can over and over create moments of empathy and shared goal setting. We don't have to agree on everything. We don't have to agree, for instance, as the most recent Nobel Peace Prize winner says, she would like to make sure we get to zero nuclear weapons. We work with her, but we also work with people who say, you know what, we may not be able to get there. But we can all agree that we don't want to have some kind of accidental catastrophe on our watch. So, beginning with that, in teams, getting larger and larger, we can create scale around that shared agreement.
Maybe a final thought on empathy is that I believe one of Doug Engelbart's big questions was how do you change people's way of thinking to change their behaviors? And I think about this a lot too, and I'm sure we all have a lot to consider, but I'm sure that one of the vital ingredients is empathy and human connection.
And in your work, what's thinking, for example, in the climate debate, what's that common ground? If you were going to advise someone to find the common ground for all sides in the climate debate, in the spirit of what Erika just observed, how would you frame that?
Well, what's really interesting is I have had very interesting discussions with people that are climate deniers. I've also interacted with people that believe GMOs cause autism. I also taught in a middle school in North Carolina where I was asked not to say the word evolution. And what
was the alternative word you used?
So I still taught evolution because it's part of the curriculum, but I said adaptation and change over time. And nobody caused a fuss. And it just shows how important language is and measured reactions. And I'm very interested to know where these ideas come from. And I recognize that my perspective is very different than their perspective in life. And I kind of turn it into a learning opportunity for myself in kind of a selfish way. And I found that I've had very productive discussions with climate deniers and people that believe GMOs cause autism because they see I'm trying to understand where they're coming from, and they afford me the same courtesy.
You know, you asked about a scenario, and just based on some of the things that both of you had said, I would offer one up. So it's the year 2040, and in the year 2040, I have a 14-year-old son, but let's say he's 14 in the year 2040. He's going to a school where a lot of what happens over the course of the day is he's learning techniques for working with other people and for empathizing. But he's also using tools, technological tools every day that he trusts because they are ways to build greater empathy and understanding. And he can see that feedback. He can see his voice showing up by giving a proxy, and you mentioned liquid democracy, giving somebody else who's got greater understanding, for instance, of climate and oceans. Maybe my son is saying, well, as a 14-year-old, I look forward to giving my proxy vote to Erika Woolsey when it comes to the oceans, because I will never know as much as she knows about it, but I trust her, and the technology allows me to get close to her. So I can begin to see a world in which we're educating young people in ways that don't separate technology from the human factors that will make them better at problem solving. So it's an inadequate scenario, but I think we have all the tools we need to begin that scenario today.
I also think just one note on the climate issue, which is, I think, an especially vexing one from a public policy perspective, because there's not a natural sort of sympathetic character that you can sort of wheel out and sort of mobilize people around. I do think that kids have a unique opportunity here. We see on a regular basis young teenagers, and in fact, in particular, a number of teenage girls who have started campaigns on the site that have been immensely powerful, mobilizing people. And it's really hard to argue with teenage girls on TV. It turns out you put
or
like
anywhere,
sort of Republican congressperson and sort of a teenager on TV, and it doesn't end well for the member of Congress. And I'll give you one illustration of a campaign. So you lose before you begin. It's just an 11-year-old girl who she lives just north of Chicago, and there's she starts a campaign on the site to try to get a tax on plastic bags for like a school project. And then in response, the chemical lobby in the state of Illinois gets a special interest basically law passed to make it illegal for cities in Illinois to pass a tax on plastic bags. So it has to be state-based. And so she is 11, doesn't know any better, and is undeterred, and she starts a petition to her governor to veto the bill. And this is just like no one cares about this. It's like not in the news at all. Until like Abby Goldberg, she has this incredible personal story. She's like, very knowledgeable of the topic, incredibly newsworthy and sort of media savvy. And we work with her, and sort of she ends up doing this big delivery and gets hundreds of thousands of people to join. And it ends up being the case that the governor of her state calls her on a Saturday on her home phone and says, Abby, I've seen your campaign. I'm going to veto the bill, and you're the first to know. Vetoes the bill. Then all these kids across the country start campaigns around plastic bags and plastic straws and all these different plastic. And like they're just very sympathetic characters, little kids, turns out. And I just think there's a way where, sort of kids can kind of call bullshit on adults for the future. And it's like you're screwing it for the rest of us, and it's hard to argue with little kids, as I mentioned. And so I just do think there's an opportunity for most issues. Healthcare, immigration, LGBT rights, all these things, there are like sympathetic characters that can speak on their own behalf. The sort of, people that have been put in structural sort of systematic injustice. But for the environment, it's really hard. Same for animal rights, to be honest. And kids are a really powerful vehicle for accessing those issues.
So this is a moment in time where it seems like, especially in the last couple of months, pessimism has become the new and oh so fashionable black. And that seems a singularly dangerous thing to me, that nothing causes trouble worse than a sense of despair and you can't make a difference. And you all are right in the middle of making a difference, and you've built communities that aren't falling into that trap. How do we amplify that? How do we create a paradigm where optimism outweighs pessimism?
Hmm.
I mean, I would say,
Suddenly we're not so talkative.
No.
Yeah.
Well, we try to do every day. So I would say, one of the perversities is the perverse incentives of media companies, not because they're bad people, but because they are companies trying to maximize revenue, and we are humans that have fear-based reflexive systems that click on things that are most outrageous and sensationalized. And we largely have ad-based systems and not subscription-based, is that we have a saturated media environment of this sort of, pessimism. And I think it is one of the most corrosive things to an effective democracy, because if you have people that do not have hope and do not participate, then you guarantee the very thing they fear, right. Which is unrepresentative government, and then you get even more frustration, and then even more radical reactions in elections, and worse than we might have today. And so what we're trying to do, and I hope many other people are trying to do as well, is how do you craft remarkable stories of everyday people making change that are actually interesting and newsworthy. One of the challenges in the social change sector is how do you make climate change and nuclear sort of, non-proliferation sexy and exciting, sufficient to have the media cover it and that people want to consume it. And so on a daily basis, we almost think about these as shows. If you were to produce an epic HBO show around immigration, healthcare, human trafficking, whatever it is, or just people making change in a local environment, like how do you make something incredible and not just feel good, but really inspirational and exciting such that they not just consume it, but share it as well. So part of us is trying, how do you identify remarkable stories of everyday people and spread it through the media and tell those stories? And I'll just be honest, we're not as good as, nearly as I would like us to be, and we are trying to hire to address that.
I also think we have to look at who the juggernauts in our culture are, and I think, frankly, there are probably people in this room. We have a lot of responsibility for creating a sense of optimism. I think, we glorify technology companies, we glorify media celebrities, and so forth.
Now you're starting to sound a little pessimistic here.
No, I'm not. I'm not pessimistic, because actually what I'm trying to say is I think you give people something very positive to do, and you make it easy for them to do it, and that becomes a positive feedback loop. And I think the truth is, the more celebrities and the more large companies who step into some of these issues that they've stayed away from because maybe they're too politically complex, and begin to make positive strides and tell positive stories about them and make it okay to engage with some of these issues. Nuclear weapons is one that people have tended to stay away from. I think that these are, people look for positive stories when they see them happening in their own backyard or in their own offices. That is influential.
So Erika W., you're in a field where you have the benefit that you have the potential to use charismatic animals. Doesn't work so well in nuclear. And you also have, of course, famously, someone who was very good at this decades ago is Jacques Cousteau. What are the lessons the rest of us can learn from the field you're in and the work you're doing?
Well, in terms of charismatic megafauna, first of all, I study corals who don't have faces.
Okay, we think corals are charismatic. Yeah.
Good, I'm glad. But there's been a shift in recent decades in science, especially marine science, where it goes from single species research into ecosystem research and single species protection into ecosystem protection. So, how like protecting the panda also protects crucial habitat, protecting turtles and dolphins also protects coral reefs. And I think that holistic approach is very important and the great direction to go in. And to comment on the optimism and despair, I wonder if despair is a byproduct of optimism, because we're all trying to imagine this world that we want, but it's not what we're seeing every day. And
lower expectations.
Actually, a phrase I really try to live by, I think I'm paraphrasing Voltaire, is that don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? Just because you can't do everything and solve all the problems every day doesn't mean you shouldn't do everything you can. And to me, that really helps compartmentalize, because sometimes it does feel like we're living in a dystopian hellscape. But I also look towards the success stories, and there's so much good going on in climate change and ocean protection. I mean, the investments in renewables by the fossil fuel industry, the leaders in governments like in California, and this amazing youth movement of taking our planet back. And I think all of that is so exciting, and it's important to remember all the good things that are happening.
Yeah, I think that, the paradox that it is simultaneously true that we are in the best position we've ever been historically as humanity, and we're in the most dangerous situation we've ever been in humanity.
It would have been great to get started 20 years ago, but the second best option is starting now.
There's an old Chinese proverb, what's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. What's the second best time to plant a tree? Today. I've gotten a couple of questions about education, and that runs through everything that all three of you do. What are your thoughts about education, and what are the leverage points here, and how does that tie to Doug's vision of collective intelligence?
Well, I think that it's telling that Erika talks about having such a good experience at the Stanford D School. I assume that most people know what that is, but the design school at Stanford. And I'm a big proponent of teaching both design skills, which are skills of cooperation, skills of envisioning, skills of empathy, skills of needs finding, very early in schools. And I think we're seeing much more of that, project-based learning and design-based learning. I also, frankly, think that we should teach all kids to be scenario planners. We teach history in schools. Why don't we teach skills about thinking about the future?
So let me put a sharper point on this. Christina earlier showed the famous Doug Engelbart slide of technology growing exponentially and organizational wisdom growing not so fast. And I think it was Will and Ariel Durant who once said that civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. Is education the place we need to pick up to close that gap? Or is it somewhere else?
I think it's redesigning how we learn and how we measure knowledge and understanding, and making it focused more on problem solving and flexible thinking than on memorization. And being able to develop your own tools to apply to any situation. And I'm very interested in information literacy and science literacy, so that people can be more immune to misinformation, because in this age of information, it's not about finding the right answer. It's also about discarding waves upon waves of bad info. And I think looking at informal and formal learning systems to really hold those principles highly, because it's about how we think, not what we think.
I mean, maybe the one slightly controversial approach I take on this is not that education doesn't matter. It's that if you're trying to have systemic change in an issue, and it is set or in something quite grand, trying to believe that we are going to sort of, change everyone by educating everyone differently in a much more material way, and that's going to somehow create some systemic shift. Humans genetically, dispositionally are quite similar to what we were 10,000 years ago. And I think institutional shift is something that's so fundamentally important. So think of why do we have this, failed, I think, largely democracy that we have? It is not simply because if we just educated people more, that would be sufficient. I think we need a design institutions such that we can translate more effectively people's general default preferences into effective long-term policy outcomes in service of the interests of the public. I think of just one specific example, actually, just as an illustration of the idiocy of our institutional design and how big a consequence this might have. Voting. So we can either educate lots of people to try to be better at voting, or just more informed and want to go vote. And there's really important things there. The thing that we're trying to do is an institutional structure design where you're voting based upon people that you trust, but something specific around ranked choice voting versus just first past the post voting. So we vote first past the post. So you have, for example, in the Republican primary in 2016, you have 18 candidates, and so you have people distribute the votes across all these different candidates. It ends up being the case that the person who is most disliked by the majority of Republican primary voters is the one who wins, because we don't have ranked choice voting. That is just insane. That's just an incompetent system. It's not whether you support Trump or not. It is literally just a mistake. It is not an accurate representation of people's actual preferences. If you had ranked choice voting, we would literally probably have, and this is $1 trillion consequence from a single design flaw in an institution that is some small example of larger design flaws as well. And so I think we need to think of high leverage points of intervention that don't require us to boil the ocean, that can actually get us much more to where we want to get to.
Don't talk about boiling the ocean in front of her.
Oh, sorry, yes. Bad analogy.
So I have we're right down at the end, and we actually have a little bit less time than I hoped for an answer to this question, so you all have to think very fast. Imagine that Doug Engelbart strolled in here and said, well done, chose the panel well. These are exactly the kind of folks who are capable of exponential change and improvement, and you've taken all the lessons to heart. He said, I'm going to give you what DARPA gave me 52 years ago. I'm going to give you a 2-year lead time and a large budget to do a demo. What is the demo? So you have the budget and you've got 24 months to get ready. What demo would you do today? Or 2 years from now?
Well, I'm actually happy to answer this because I feel like we just did something similar to this. And in a way, what you've described is our team has been living this scenario. We were given a certain amount of money by major philanthropy several years ago and asked to show some proof of concept that collaborative teams working together across sectors with experts in the room could produce better results, essentially, than experts would on their own. And just 2 weeks ago at the Rhode Island School of Design, we had the first demo of the results of the first cohort of the network that we've built. One of the demos was of a new data fusion platform, open source data that aggregates everything from satellite imaging to social media data to export control data, and allows journalists and academics to make sense of what's going on around the world in nuclear nations. So it's essentially an intelligence system.
So she's already done her demo.
Yeah, done my demo.
No pressure.
2 years of vacation. Yeah, I would be really excited about diving into something similar to what I mentioned, but the idea of how do you, firstly, what happens when you have a dynamic network of people who can go indicate by proxy the sort of people, experts, individuals they respect, or they get surfaced in the system that they trust most to express voice on specific issues, and then use that graph to be able to then crowdsource from anybody ideas for different legislation and sort of modifications similar to Wikipedia based upon trust, which Wikipedia also uses, and see what the ultimate policy outcomes would be, both in preferences and in innovation for addressing big problems in that kind of effective liquid democracy voting system. And then see how you could scale that. I mean, the biggest problem with that system, I think, is how do you get distribution, which is why literally our first focus is how do you get 50 million Americans, and then how do you apply that system to it?
So not to put pressure on you, but I know, you had a family connection with Doug Engelbart, and you also have a family connection to Charles and Ray Eames, who did a demo once upon a time, Powers of 10, that is in the same Olympian space as Engelbart's demo. So you've been preparing for a long time for this.
First of all, I think based on what Christina said, I don't think he would come in and say, well done. I think he would
You're right.
say we're scratching the surface. So with that analogy, I'd like to
You're not off the
break
hook
the
yet.
surface and dive in, right? Because I actually do have an idea, and it is an idea I'm looking to fund. And that is that addressing the idea that our ocean is so overexploited, so underprotected, and entirely out of mind to most people on Earth, even though human society relies on ocean health. And so my idea that I've come up with in recent years is to take people in landlocked states where they don't have any access to the ocean on virtual dives. And these are states that also have great influence on affecting climate policy, and yet they don't have that connection. And so it's one of those out of sight, out of mind issues. So I would like to unlock the ocean for those in landlocked states, to share the beauty and wonder and importance of these ecosystems that their behaviors, hundreds of miles from the ocean, is affecting.
Bravo!
Anyone want to write me a check?
And with that, we will end the panel. Please thank our panelists. That was marvelous.
Thanks, very nice. It was great, Paul, thank you. Really enjoyed